Welcome to the Captains of History podcast. In today's episode, we reflect on the life and legacy of Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar was, and continues to be, one of the most intriguing, admired, and controversial figures in history. He was a complicated man, with many seeming contradictions in his character. On the one hand, he was the bloodthirsty conqueror who slaughtered 1 million Gauls and enslaved another 1,000,000. On the other hand, he was an eminently cultured man who wrote poetry, believed in clemency, and was the champion of the common people of Rome. But not even his worst enemies doubted his courage, his competence, or his ability. His brief rule over the Republic was far from tyrannical, with no oppression or political purges. Only those Romans who continued to take up armed rebellion against him after repeated pardons were faced with death. Freedom of speech wasn't curtailed during his tenure as dictator. Cicero was able to write and publish his pamphlet extolling the virtues of Caesar's greatest enemy, Cato. Almost every other autocrat in history would have suppressed the publication and executed the author. Instead, Caesar wrote a response, called the Anti-Cato. He wrote this at a time while he was engaged in a war against the young Pompeys in Spain, and with all of his other administrative, legal, religious, and military duties. The way Caesar has been studied and viewed since his death has always been dependent on the different historical contexts of the day and individuals or society's political ideology. Many of the political right in the modern era see Caesar as a positive figure, and there is even a Red Caesar movement calling for a charismatic strongman to break the American elite, just as Caesar destroyed the Roman oligarchs' hold on power. Those on the political left see Caesar as a negative figure, a precursor to modern right-wing populism, a man who single-handedly destroyed democracy and began the era of despotic emperors. In his lifetime, he was loved by his men and the Roman people, but despised by many of his fellow noblemen. After his death, his assassins and partisans continued to fight over his legitimacy. When his chosen heir, the later Emperor Augustus, emerged supreme, his legacy was secured. Thanks to Augustus, the name Caesar evolved into a royal dynastic title. There was a Caesar, or some variation, in power right up until the 20th century. Even in the 21st century, the last Tsar of Bulgaria, Simeon II, won election as Prime Minister of the country. That means for over 2,000 years, a Caesar has been at the helm of state continuously. Many figures throughout history have sought to emulate the Roman dictator, from Napoleon Bonaparte to Suleiman the Magnificent to Mussolini. However, when it comes to reflecting on Caesar's life and achievements, it's essential they are viewed in the historical context. While contemporary Western society reviles those who seek military expansion and imperial conquest, in the 1st century BC, attitudes were very different. The people and nations Caesar conquered and enslaved would have done the same to Italy and the Romans given the chance. Italy had faced multiple generations of threats from the marauding tribes of Gaul and Germania. Only 50 years before Caesar's conquests, northern barbarians had ravaged northern Italy and Spain for years. They crushed multiple Roman armies, and had they not been distracted by heading off to Spain, likely would have conquered Rome itself. Only the brilliant generalship of Caesar's uncle, Gaius Marius, saved the day. It's not hard then to imagine why the people of Italy and Rome rejoiced at the conquest of Gaul. The threat to their lives, families, and properties was put to an end. And it's in this context that we must assess Caesar and his legacy. Political. In the generations following his life and death, Caesar remained a controversial political figure. In his early years, Augustus relied heavily on political propaganda, extolling the virtues of his adopted father. After his own victories in the civil wars and successful rule over the empire, he came to rely less and less on the name and achievements of Julius Caesar. Some historians have taken that to mean that he purposely distanced himself from Caesar. But it's more likely that, as time passed, new generations were born, and the list of his own great achievements grew, he simply had less need to. The duty of every young Roman aristocrat was to add to the dignitas and auctoritas of his family. In their early career, the best way to make your name known was by publicizing the successes of your father and other ancestors. In time, an aristocrat's own achievements became more important than those of their father, and in this Augustus was no different to any other Roman nobleman. Julius Caesar had used the name and triumph of Marius in his own early career. What is true is that Augustus went in a different political direction than Caesar, learning from his father's mistakes. Caesar wore his power and authority nakedly out in the open. Augustus veiled his under a web of traditions and customs. Where Caesar was the dictator perpetuo, Augustus was merely the princeps, the first citizen. Many of the Roman writers of the Principate era heralded Cato and Brutus as the role models of a Roman man over Julius Caesar. Even under the rule of the Caesars, the man whose name they bore was an ambiguous figure. Later Romans and other societies have held less ambiguous views of Caesar. The Emperor Napoleon overtly modelled his new French Empire on Caesar and Augustus's regimes. This form of regime has been defined as Caesarism in political science. Caesarism is an ideology espousing authoritarian and populist principles. Essentially, it is the legitimacy of autocratic powers by popular acclamation. A charismatic strongman ruling a military-dominated state, running a regime of magnificent splendor and spectacle, and pushing popular causes. Just as Caesar championed the common people of Rome over the senatorial oligarchs, a later proponent of Caesarism, Napoleon III, rallied the workers behind his absolute rule in the face of liberal industrialists. The highly influential Marxist philosopher Antonio Gramsci claimed that every Caesarist movement comes about because of a crisis of authority in the state. As was the case with the Emperor Napoleon, who famously declared, "I have found the crown in the gutter. I picked it up, and the people put it on my head." And the German historian Oswald Spengler believed that Caesarism was the natural successor of democracy, claiming all democracies would eventually descend into Caesarism. In our contemporary world, many political figures are described as following Caesarian models of rule. Russian President Vladimir Putin is the most obvious example of this. Many attempts have been made by both the political left and right in America and abroad to paint Donald Trump as an American Caesar. Despite this complicated historiography, it's clear that Caesar's life still resonates with many people, even to this day. At the remains of his altar in Rome, flowers and other offerings are left daily by travellers from all around the world. It remains a popular sight of pilgrimage to venerate and honour his memory. Military. Caesar is perhaps most famous for his military accomplishments. The conqueror of Gaul, the first Roman commander to venture to Britannia, and the vanquisher of all the other Roman generals. His genius expanded the rule of the Roman Republic into hostile lands never before pacified by Roman arms. Caesar proved he was too great a leader for both the warlike people of Gaul and the most celebrated Roman military man of all time, Pompey Magnus. Caesar was by no means perfect, and he suffered defeats and setbacks, but he always emerged victorious. His most important attributes were his decisive speed of movement and his boldness. Not one of his rival commanders could ever find solutions to deal with the unbelievable agility and endurance he showed. His men followed, respected, and loved him because he suffered every hardship they suffered. He fought in the front line when morale was shaky, and he showered them with honours and riches. Many of his veterans and legions remained loyal to his memory, fighting for the young Octavian in the civil wars and serving him as the Emperor Augustus. Some have claimed his achievements were solely down to leading a Roman army, the most proficient fighting force of the ancient world. But his defeat of every other Roman army he faced, including that of Pompey Magnus, and when he was usually heavily outnumbered, shows that his leadership was an essential part of his army's success. The rediscovery of his commentaries in the 15th century played a large part in the increasing sophistication of the European armies during this period. The Emperor Napoleon claimed to be directly inspired by Caesar's generalship in his own illustrious career. His nephew, the Emperor Napoleon III, sponsored archaeological programs aimed at uncovering and understanding the sites of the Gallic Wars. Caesar's campaigns are still studied by military academies today. Such is the insight that can be drawn from his tactical and strategic genius. Cultural. One of the areas of Caesar's life least often discussed is his literary prowess. He was a prolific writer and was always found to be dictating a poem, book, or polemic. In his own lifetime, Caesar was viewed as one of the greatest orators of the Republic, in the same category as Cicero. He had studied rhetoric with the same Greek tutor as Cicero and was universally praised for his rhetoric. Unfortunately, apart from his commentaries on the Gallic and Civil Wars, only brief fragments of his other works have come down to us. Brief quotes from his eulogy to his aunt Julia and his Anti-Cato have survived, but the rest is lost to history. We know he wrote poems in praise of the legendary hero Hercules, a tragedy on Oedipus, and a poem recounting his voyage to Hispania. The loss of these works is a tragedy. Hopefully, in the fullness of time, more works by Roman authors will be discovered, and among them will be Caesar's lost writings. The works that have come down to us, written by Caesar, the Commentari di Bello Gallico and the Commentari di Bello Civili, were and are widely praised both in his own day and now as masterful works of literature, clear, crisp, and concise Latin at its very best. And it's remarkable that amongst his endless activity in war and politics, he found time to be a consummate author. Caesar has immense cultural impact, appearing in countless works of literature, theatre, film, paintings, and more. Most famously in Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar. The Bard of Avon did not have the most positive view of the Roman dictator. Other authors have been more positive in their reflection on Caesar. Colleen McCulloch's Masters of Rome series is the most consummate fictional depiction of Caesar and the late Republic, starting with the lives of Marius and Sulla and ending with the victory of Octavian. The series is breathtaking in its detail, accuracy, and scope. Colleen McCulloch was clearly a fan of Caesar, as she portrayed him extremely positively throughout the series. The differing cultural depictions of Caesar illuminate more than anything else the intense range of emotions people continue to view his life with, and the dichotomy of his own complicated and nuanced character. Ave Caesar. The Republic of Caesar's birth and life was one of intense violence, political division, and governmental crises. The slaughter of Saturninus and his followers, the murder of Marcus Livius Drusus and the social war, the civil wars of Marius, Cinna, and Sulla, the rebellion of Lepidus, and the brutal insurgency of Sertorius. All of these occurred during Caesar's early years. Caesar is sometimes credited with single-handedly destroying the Republic and imposing tyranny on the liberty-loving Romans. But the truth is, the Republic was in terminal decay. It was a deeply corrupt oligarchy, where the richest continued to expand their wealth, while the middle and lower classes were squeezed remorselessly. The very attributes which had led the tiny city-state of Rome into world dominion had caused incessant calamities and increasing friction between elites. Caesar was the product of his age, his country, and his social group. He was one of many who ultimately were responsible for the end of the Republican system of government. His great rival in the Civil War and upholder of senatorial Republican values, Pompey, had a career of far greater illegality and unconstitutionality than Caesar ever had. Ultimately, as Caesar was victorious, he will forever be most associated with the end of the Republic. As a man, he had a unique magnetism, a charisma, and a personality which dominated and inspired devotion and hatred in equal parts. He was the greatest of all the Romans, a leader whose name symbolized power and authority, and whose deeds echo throughout human history. Love him or loathe him, undoubtedly, Gaius Julius Caesar, dictator for life of the Roman Republic, is one of the greatest captains of history.